In this episode of Let's Talk, Bernard Conlon talks about the context of impartiality in writing a piece of journalism. As someone that's worked in television for the BBC, and there's a kind of sense of impartiality that you have to have, how do you find, how would you write from an impartial perspective? What kind of ideas could you give potential students of writing?
Impartiality needs to be the context of who you're writing for, what you're writing for, what your purpose is very important. If you're working as a mainstream journalist, impartiality is part of the mindset that you have to develop. But there will be times when you're, as a writer, if you're writing in a political environment, for example, I had a press officer role for the SDLP, so you had to write subjectively, in relation to the organisation that you worked for. You had to write press releases that were politically angled or had an ideological flavour. But you also, I think the journalistic value system that I was inculcated with always give you the sense that you always had to make sure that what you were saying was credible. And sometimes if you became too vociferous, too outrageous, then the credibility of what you're writing or saying becomes undermined. So impartiality and balance is always a good anchor value to have at the back of your mind. It's very important.
And what about sources, researching multiple sources for stories? How important was that, and how did you go about doing that?
Well, again, my journalistic background and experience was a mixed bag. I mean, I did a short period on a journalism course in Belfast, and then I got the job for a year and a half in a political environment. So a lot of stuff I was doing was press releases, writing party publications, producing publications, policy documents. So all the sources for most of what I wrote was in-house. A press statement would be issued by a spokesman. And so what he said on reacting to a certain subject was the main body of the statement or the press release. So the party spokesman was the source. So when you're working in an organisation like a political party, the source is ready, available. You don't go out and have to seek so much. But when I went to live in Brussels after Luxembourg, after I'd spent about 6 months in Luxembourg, I then went up to Brussels and got a job for 3 years with a small publishing house that dealt with European affairs. I then had to go and interview people, find out where the source of information was. But Brussels was very contained. There was a daily press process, a briefing process. The European Commission held daily press conferences. So again, you attended those day and daily as part of your routine, and there was press releases on every aspect of European policy being released. So picking up the press releases and then speaking to a spokesman to get a direct quote was the kind of thing that you learned to do. But you also developed your own contacts, and you were able to arrange interviews with people that you knew a lot about the particular subject. I mean, I remember literally walking the corridors of the European Commission buildings in Brussels, including the Parlement building, which is the most iconic building in Brussels, and just walking those corridors and, you know, going in and having interviews and having quite incredible access. In those days, the European Commission, I can't comment so much about what it's like today, but in the 80s and 90s, there was incredible access, and there was a great willingness on the part of even, you know, civil servants or public servants who were working on very specific issues to sit down and actually give you an interview. But sometimes they were using that as part of their legislative or policy making process, because sometimes one part of the European Commission didn't know what the other part was doing. So a specialist journalist, a writer coming in, was a way that they flagged up issues, and it all circulated within the whole process. And Brussels was very, very intense in that regard. Working as a journalist, as a writer in Brussels, it was probably much easier than being a journalist in other places, because it was physically very self-contained. You could literally walk everywhere to, you know, to get information. The buildings were all in a kind of quarter. So it was like a large bubble, and developing contacts and getting access was probably a bit more convenient and easier than in a classic journalistic situation in, say, somewhere like London, or, you know, in a small provincial newspaper. You might have to go out into the, you know, out into farms and rural villages to speak to a source. It was much more, again, ready-made.
And how would you verify that the information you were being given was true or honest? Was that an issue at all?
Probably less difficult than in a classical journalistic situation, because when you're dealing with information that is released by public institutions, it's very informational and fact-based to begin with. The information that if you had a program or a piece of legislation or a policy, they're giving information in a very, I suppose, public minded way. They're giving you the facts. There's not so much kind of colour when you're getting information from a public institution. There's not a lot of colour. There's a little bit of propaganda. Of course, they're flagging what they're doing as an institution, but the information that you'll be getting in a press release will be factual. But to add value to it yourself, you had to generate your own questions, and it was raising the questions and putting those questions in the context of an interview that you sometimes were able to read between the lines and generate value. And the verification process was, I guess, through your own questioning.
We have more on the way, so please subscribe to this channel and check out the link below if you'd consider becoming a patron to help us keep making more content. Thanks for watching.